This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Psychology is always a subject that everybody thinks they know something about it, but most people don't have the academic training that you and many of your colleagues do have. And today we're going to talk about some of these aspects, particularly in the issues in which you have been working, which is leadership and their followers. So today we have Dr. Loren Naidoo, who is a native from Montreal, Canada, beautiful city. He got his bachelor's in psychology from McGill University, which is a very well-known university north to the United States, and his master's and doctorate from the University of Akron in Ohio. Today, he's an associate professor of psychology at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, Baruch College, City University of New York. So welcome to College Talk, Dr. Naidoo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
The first question I have for you is the basic one. Why do you become interested in psychology? Why you became a psychologist?
Well, you know, I started out being very interested from a very young age in biology. So I loved animals, birds, and wildlife, and spent much of my time running around the woods in Canada, identifying different species and such. And, that was really my first real love. And, in high school, I had a really close friend of mine, James, who was somebody everyone sort of liked and looked up to and wanted to be his friend. And, he, at a certain point, he attempted suicide, and that just really floored me and all of our friends and really made me wonder, how is it that this person that everyone really looks up to and thinks is wonderful could, feel this way about himself without any of us knowing as well. And so that really kind of spurred my interest in psychology. And then through, my experiences in undergraduate studies, I got involved in research quite early on at McGill. And there was something really thrilling to me about designing a study, and often at this point in my career it was in social psychology, so little sort of small manipulations and seeing how these change people's behavior. And then there's nothing quite so exciting as conducting a study and collecting your data and then being able to look at the data and see, well, wow, like what I actually had people do really made an impact on their behavior, and sort of seeing that, and having it, tangible was really exciting to me. So that's where my interest in psychology started. And then, I got interested in industrial organizational psychology in particular by virtue of having a somewhat strange experience of being hired by the government of Canada as an undergraduate student and for a couple of years after to conduct training with small and medium-sized enterprises in and around Montreal on the internet and email. These were sort of new things, relatively new things at the time, so I'm showing them a little bit old. And, the government had decided that, well, whereas large businesses had largely adopted these innovations, small and medium-sized businesses were lagging. And so the idea was to, hire a bunch of sort of young, tech-savvy kids and have them, go to different small and medium-sized enterprises and train people in how to use, these new innovations, which was really neat experience for me to get to see so many different work environments. And one thing that I noticed, pretty quickly was within minutes of arriving at an organization, I got the sense of whether it was sort of a nice place to work where people enjoy their work and get along, or the opposite where, there were a few places that I just immediately could not wait to get done and get out of there, where it's a very unpleasant, noxious kind of environment. And this really made me interested in studying how psychology applies, to the workplace. And another fun fact, I in fact was hired to do what was called Year 2000 consulting, which was, preparing organizations for the potential technological fallout of the switch to the year 2000. So that was quite fun too.
Well, supposedly we were going to get into this catastrophe and the world was going to stop because all the computers were going to crash.
Now you know who to thank, right?
Exactly.
So anyway, right.
Now, you have specialized in an area that is basically leadership and how people respond to leadership. Why do you become interested in a particular area?
Well, I think it goes back to my experiences in high school and in college as an athlete. In high school, I played 4 or 5 sports each year, spent a lot of time playing basketball and volleyball in particular. And in college, I played volleyball. And some of the most influential figures in my life were some of the coaches that I had as leaders, of our team. These were pretty much all team sports, and I think that's where my interest initially came from was these experiences as an athlete, and how one particular coach, Linda Genre, who's my high school volleyball coach. I think growing up and at a young age, I was very much focused on performing well, having other people see how well I was doing. I had an older brother who was always better than me at everything. He's 3 years older, better athlete, always beat me in basketball, better student. And so I was really focused on sort of showing how good I was at a young age. And that's really a maladaptive mindset when it comes to a lot of contexts, particularly sports as well as academics, this focus on showing how good you are. And this one coach, Linda Genre, really kind of changed my my mentality, my my approach to athletics, and made me realize that it's much more productive to focus on the things that you can control to improve your own performance, not worry about what other people think of you, not worry about these external things that are outside of your control. And that really, again, made me interested in leadership.
Now, many organizations have kind of vertical leadership, where it's clearly who is the head of that organization and everybody follows that pattern. Others are more horizontal with some kind of visible face. And there are some who argue that in a really egalitarian society, we don't really need leaders if we know where to go. Do you agree with that assessment?
Do I agree? Do we need leaders? I mean, I think there may be circumstances in which you can have a functional work group, for example, without a formal leader. I think that's possible, sure. I think, though, that even where you don't have formal leadership, you typically have informal leaders who emerge spontaneously. And, that may not be what people think of when they think of leadership. They may think of the sort of positional leadership. But you always have leadership in one form or another. And some of my own research involves, for example, taking undergraduate students and forming a team. Perhaps they've never met each other before, and having them do a task. And typically in those circumstances, you see 1 or 2 people emerge spontaneously as the leader, and they take on those kinds of leader roles, even though they're not formally assigned.
Now, when you use the term leader, most people immediately think about politics.
Yeah.
That's where they see leaders. Is there any way we can say these are the characteristics of a good political leader?
Well, I would have to say I'm not as familiar with political leadership compared to workplace leadership. But, the general research on leadership suggests that there are certain traits that you tend to see, although no particular universal set of traits for leaders. But some of the things you would see would include somebody who's intelligent, somebody who has high achievement orientation, and someone who's relatively dominant, meaning they want to kind of take charge. And then you have certain behaviors that leaders engage in, like setting an agenda, setting tasks for their followers on the one hand, and then also managing relationships on the other hand. Now, political leadership may be sort of meaningfully different from the kind of leadership that I study, in that, or somewhat anyway, in that the distance between the leader and the follower in political leadership tends to be quite large, where, for example, most of us, have never met the leader of our respective countries. We interact much more sort of indirectly. We see them in the media and such. And, I think the experience of political leadership for everyday people is quite different from the experience of the people working for those leaders. And it's hard sometimes to see how the kind of real leadership behaviors within those political teams, within a cabinet, within a whatever, are operating from the outside.
Now, one of the attributes that is usually associated with good leaders is charisma.
Yes.
Tell us about that, because some people may say, well, you don't need to be really charismatic to be a good leader. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think you can be a good leader. I mean, it really depends on what you mean by a good leader. It depends on what outcomes we want to attribute to leadership or what we're focusing on. But no, I think it's possible to be a good leader without being particularly charismatic. And by charisma, I think maybe we know what that means. But generally, we're talking about a personal magnetism, having a vision, being able to communicate that vision to followers in a maybe sort of novel or like an unconventional way. So I think certainly you could be a good leader without being charismatic. Often the ability to influence other people that charisma affords you gives you a greater chance to be charismatic. Unfortunately, there are some downsides to potential downsides anyway, to being charismatic. And, there's, in fact, research on what's called the dark side of charisma, where you have a very influential leader who is, motivated by a sort of personalized power motive rather than a socialized power motive. So they're really sort of interested in self-aggrandizing and pursuing their own kind of narcissistic goals. And some of this might sound somewhat familiar at this point. I think, yes, charisma can benefit leadership, but there are some downsides, certainly.
For people who are listening to this interview, they may say, well, I'm in a position of leadership in my organization, a company, a school, you name it. What would be the most fatal error that you can commit, kind of harakiri, if you want to be a good leader? So what kind of things you shouldn't do? You have to be very aware of avoid doing.
Well, so this brings to mind some of the research on what's called derailment, where you have typically executive leaders who are quite successful and end up in high-level positions and then fail. So there's a body of research on this phenomenon. And typically what you see there, it's not a lack of technical skills, typically. It's usually issues to do with, uncertain morality, where if you're willing to cut corners and you have no firm kind of moral principles that are guiding your actions, then that's a classic way of derailing. Often it might involve interpersonal issues, a kind of inflexibility or inability to take other people's feedback and make adjustments. These kinds of issues typically.
Okay. Now, this reminds me of something I read once, and you are a college professor, I have been a college professor, that has to do with education. And what I heard was someone wrote, students may not be listening to what you are saying, but they are watching you, like separating between verbal communication and body language.
Yeah.
How important is to harmonize both in order to maintain credibility?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And in fact, some of my own research deals with this to some extent. There's a lot of issues that come to mind here. So one is we tend to process a lot of information in a subconscious way, in a way that we're not directly aware of. And I think nonverbal behavior, body language, facial expressions, gestures, this kind of thing. A lot of this info is processed without us necessarily being aware of it. And, I think this is what underlies some experiences that we may have where, we meet somebody and we hear them speak, and we agree with what they're saying, and yet somehow we have a negative impression. We feel like they're maybe untrustworthy or something like that, without really being able to put our thumbs on it. And I think that can happen because there is a discrepancy between the verbal behavior, which we're processing consciously, and the nonverbal behavior, which we may be processing unconsciously. And that, when there is a discrepancy between these two things, you can get some negative reactions, I think. So I would say, yes, it's great if those two things are in line, but a lot of our nonverbal behavior is also unconscious on our part. So we may not necessarily be realizing what we're doing. And I think a great example of this from a few years back was President Bush, I think his re-election debates. He had an initial debate against, it must have been Kerry at that point, where he was grimacing a lot. And I think he got feedback from his advisors for the second debate, try to smile more. Yeah. And so he tried. And this is an example where you're sort of non-consciously engaging in some behavior and then trying to consciously override it, where he sort of seemed like grimacing, all over the time, which I think a lot of people found to be even more disconcerting than the frowns, than the authentic frowns.
Yeah. Another thing that leaders have to do with certain frequency is to deliver speeches.
Yes.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there may be a big difference between a well-written speech and a well-delivered speech.
Yeah.
To what extent you think that both of them have to be really harmonized, because you can lose credibility no matter how great ideas you were putting on paper when it comes to transmitting those ideas to your audience?
Yeah, I think you clearly need both. If you have a wonderful written speech but are unable to deliver it effectively, people don't pay attention, people don't believe what you're saying, it's not going to work. Or you could be the most charismatic person in the world, but if there's no content, if there's no vision for the future, it's not going to have an impact either. So I think you clearly need both, for an effective speech. Yeah.
Since as a psychologist you have studied all these things, let me ask you now ask you a practical question. When people who are in position of leadership seek advice of how to improve their leadership persona, do they go to people like you or they go to marketers?
Well, I don't know to what extent they go to marketers, but certainly IO psychologists are engaged in leadership development as a practice. Absolutely, that's the case. And, I haven't done that kind of consulting work that I can remember myself, but I do teach classes on leadership and workshops on leadership in which we do engage in this process of trying to build leadership skills. And I think you can. It doesn't come naturally to everyone, but some simple things that leaders can do to improve would be, develop a vision if you don't have one. Where do you want to go? Rather than focusing on kind of day-to-day operational types of issues. Although, those are important and you can't ignore them, but also think kind of long-term, big picture. Craft your vision in a way that's exciting to people. These are things that can be improved on, and certainly, my colleagues in IO psychology are engaged in that kind of work.
Okay. Is there something in that certain organizations that are, like, for example, the military, that we can learn from them, that we can use in civil society to make leaders more effective?
Yeah, there's a long history of in psychology of looking at the military, and in fact, a lot of the very early work in social psychology came from military problems that needed psychologists, to develop solutions for. The military, much like political leadership is different in certain ways to leadership at work, the military is also different in certain ways compared to work leadership. You tend to have more rigid hierarchies in the military. And I think for most of us, the stakes are much higher in the military than in our own work. You're literally putting your life on the line. So I think there are some meaningful differences. But Clearly, a lot of the research that's been done on military samples has been used to inform workplace leadership. A number of studies in the military in Israel, for example, by people like Dov Eden and others, have been really influential in terms of how we understand workplace leadership. So, there are differences, yes, but the nice thing about the military is that given the rigid hierarchy, it's quite easy in some cases to do research with that sample. They're very excited and very motivated to have psychologists help them.
It's interesting that you mentioned the case of Israel, because actually the Israeli army has a aura, or at least this is the talk around, that is probably the most democratic of all of the armies in the world, where actually subordinates can challenge their superiors' decisions in certain areas. Tell me how that kind of situation can be transplanted to civil organizations, and to tell people, I am a good leader because I allow people to challenge my decisions, and I actually respond positively to that kind of challenges.
Yeah, I think that's probably more the case in workplaces compared to the military. I would imagine that, in fact, there's even greater, that good leaders are providing their followers even greater latitude in workplaces. And I think it's typically to leaders' benefit to listen to their followers and learn from them. It's a great source of feedback. But also there's a whole area of research that looks at followership. So, we think of leadership, we tend to think immediately of the leader, but really there's more than one party here. Leader, no matter what the leader does, if they don't have followers, they're not a leader. So, one of the key insights of my advisor, Bob Lord at University of Akron, was this recognition that, in fact, leadership as a process really resides largely in the eyes of the followers. A lot of it's happening through how followers process information, what the leader's doing, how he or she is doing it. So we do need to think of them, too.
Now, you mentioned the word follower, and what came to my mind immediately, especially connecting with your earlier work with the internet, is to what extent now social media has changed the way leaders communicate with their followers. And have we learned anything that tell us, well, this is a totally different medium that we need to deal with in a separate way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not terribly literate in social media. I've made a conscious choice to avoid it. I'm not active on Facebook. I've never, tried Twitter, and I think that's a sort of silly position for me to take in a lot of ways, because these things are not going anywhere. And I think it's very clear if we look at the recent election here that social media is playing a role, and it's important to try to understand what that role is. As a scientist, the notion that people would uncritically consume information in the way that it seems to have happened via fake news, or even just simply a lot has been said about these sort of information bubbles where you're really just not getting exposure to other points of view, which, it's a real paradox that now, in this age we have unparalleled access to information, and yet we seem to be having narrower and narrower views. It seems that way anyway. So yeah, I think it's really critical to look at this. I'm not aware of a lot of research on leadership that does this, in fact. So that could be a nice program of research lurking there for somebody.
Yeah, because I have heard that in many organizations, the leaders get advice that they should start using social media, not to give a big speech or anything like that, but rather to keep in almost in a daily contact with the followers, with the members of the organization, to keep them informed. And so that's why I asked the question, because obviously sometimes just because of generational issues, older leaders are let's say social media impaired in some way, but others adopt it because they feel this is a good way to maintain visibility with the followers, especially if we are talking about a large organization.
Yeah, if we're talking about a large organization and high-level leaders, then I think that's possible. Although I think in a lot of organizations they do this with internal, software rather than Twitter, where everyone has access to what the leader is saying. So I think that does as a means of communication, I think organizations have adopted something similar. A lot of the time, though, it's internal rather than external. It seems to me that the Twitter type software or platforms might be more valuable from a sort of marketing standpoint, or perhaps to sort of communicate the organization's brand to attract talent and that kind of function.
So you see more as a means to communicate with other audiences outside the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's say that, for example, you are going through a moment of crisis.
Okay.
There is some bad news in the media about your organization. You are the leader. You need to respond to it. What do you think would be the most effective way to do that? Because sometimes because of the urgency, maybe you want to send an email to everybody. You want to tape a video and make it available. What do you think will be most effective for a leader to, showing that he or she is responding in a proactive way to any crisis that an organization is facing?
Yeah, I think it depends on who the audience is. First of all, if it's
internal,
then I think you want to respond quickly, even if it's to say, this has happened, we're looking into it. I think you want to appear responsive rather than unresponsive. And you said the word proactive. I think that's really critical. I think if there's some culpability, it's probably useful to apologize, and to the extent that people avoid that or attempt to kind of cover up what's happened, that's where I think you tend to get this like escalation of the problem, where it's not necessarily what you did wrong, it's how hard you tried to cover it up. I think that really gets you in trouble. But internally, it seems, like you said, proactive communication is really critical. Yeah.
Okay. Now, from a physical viewpoint, we live in an era where image seems to be everything. And, so to what extent a leader has to take care of his or her own image, not only in the physique, but also in the way he or she dresses, we're trying to convey these kind of values to the rest of the organization?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I would say I'm not terribly informed of research on that topic, specifically. But of course, in social psychology, we know that people use information about somebody's appearance to form impressions of people, and that becomes less important. I think the more you develop relationships with people, image becomes a secondary or whatever tertiary issue. But initially, I think it's probably reasonable to acknowledge that physical appearance is having an impact on people's impressions of you, and so depending on what impression you want to form, appearance or image is part of that. And so we see, maybe depending on the industry, for example, like maybe in the tech industry, unconventional sort of attire is more the norm, to show that you're sort of
one of you.
Yeah. You're exciting, new. You're not sort of constrained by these traditional issues, and that's a way of maybe attracting talent who share those values. Whereas you might have quite a different emphasis if you're in the financial services, for example.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Naidoo about this very interesting conversation on leadership and their followers in organizations. And certainly I think that this probably have elicited a lot of memories or connections for all of us who work in a particular organization, how to look at these things. And next week we're going to have with us Dr. Charlotte Brooks, who will be talking about race, China, and immigration. 3 important topics today, so stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.